was remembering a PhD who I connected with once who was, near tears because people had shamed her for not taking a job in Perth, Australia. Look, if you're from the US, Perth, Australia is around the world. Maybe you have family and friends that you want to be close to and not, a 24-hour, 48-hour journey away from, right? In total. And that few folks were shaming her of like, oh, well, you're not really committed if you're not willing to take that job on the other side of the planet. No, that's just asking too much. And I think nonprofits on the whole and universities have a really uniform culture of this. So just asking more than is really reasonable. And yes, folks are doing important work and they are willing to make some sacrifices for that work. But how much? How much are you willing to sacrifice? Willing to sacrifice your community, your friends, the way of life that you want? Sometimes the ask is just too big.
Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor, the podcast. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. In 2019, I was a political science professor who was fed up with the stress and hostility of academia, not to mention the low pay. I left my tenure-track job and went from barely surviving to thriving as a freelance academic editor. Today, I own Acadia Editing Services, an editing and coaching business that brings in 6 figures a year. In this podcast, I'll discuss the challenges of academia, what academic editing involves, and what life as a freelancer looks like. If you're willing to jump outside your comfort zone, it is possible to find joy, true flexibility, and a profitable and rewarding career as an academic editor. Thanks for listening. Welcome to Leaving Academia, Becoming a Freelance Editor. I'm your host, Paulina Cossette. Today is a very special episode because I'm here with my dear friend, Tory Wobber. Tori has a PhD in biology from Harvard. She eventually left academia to work in data science and has held leadership roles at Facebook and Google. She is now a leadership and career coach, and she helps PhDs in the social sciences to clearly and confidently make the leap into an industry role that's right for them. Through Tori's program, Academic Exit, she has helped place over 100 PhDs in industry jobs. Welcome to the podcast, Tori.
Thank you, Paulina. It's so wonderful to be here with you. And always flattering to hear an introduction of yourself, right? You're like, wow,
I've done cool stuff.
Really well, yeah.
You know, before we start, funny story. I think so like a year and a half ago when I was starting my program, I think you were the first person that I reached out to say, hey, can I be on your podcast? And I remember being so nervous. And you were like, no, it's great. Don't be nervous. So it's funny that here we are now.
Well, and I was actually just remembering just this morning, I was like, it's so wonderful that I have folks like Paulina in my circle of colleagues, functionally, right? Colleagues, friends. And I was realizing we only connected because you reached out. And I think you probably found me via LinkedIn or who knows what. But thank goodness these platforms exist because geographically we would never run into one another. And so I'm so grateful that our online paths have crossed and that now we've spent this much 2D time together. Next step, 3D, right? But it's just so wonderful to be able to build our businesses together and sort of help one another as we grow the work that we do and the more and more we serve folks. So yeah, excited that you reached out, even though it felt nervous to do so.
I agree. It's become a great friendship. So tell us your story. Tell us about what you did in academia and what made you leave and go into industry.
Yeah, so my PhD was working with chimpanzees and bonobos. Totally different from what I do now, that you can draw some parallels if you'd like. I did a lot of research in sub-Saharan Africa. I really actually enjoyed my PhD. I know many folks don't, but I loved the research I got to do. I had a lot of flexibility. I had good funding that I was able to secure. But it's funny, after 2 seasons on the faculty job market, I had done 6 on-site interviews and had 0 offers. And so folks were saying, just wait around for the 3rd season, it'll work out. But I was both skeptical. I was exhausted after that many on-site interviews. And I had really given myself that 2nd season to say okay, this is it. If not this, I'm moving on. And so when the last non-offer came in, actually from my graduate department who told me they weren't going to be hiring me. They were going to be hiring my friend instead, who had very similar work. I said, screw this. I'm going to do something else. And so I went out and did a lot of exploration. I did probably 40 informational interviews with anyone who would talk to me, roommate's mom, college, classmate, whoever it was. And through that, identified that the field of data science at that time was hiring voraciously and was happy to have quantitatively trained PhDs like myself. And so I started putting together a portfolio for that type of job, which really just meant learning SQL and sort of reslanting my abilities in their language. I also really wanted to live in California. And that was something that academia just wouldn't let me do. I'd interviewed at basically every California school that was available and hadn't gotten a job. And so it was like, okay, doing this data science work will allow me to move back and live in the place where I want to live. It'll allow me to leverage a lot of my skills, albeit in a very different context. And so 3 months after I had sort of given up on academia, I'd gotten a job as a data scientist at what was then Facebook, and was off to the races in a completely different career. I'll pause there since that's already a lot of sort of thinking and where I was. But yeah, that's where I went, where I moved to when I first left academia in 2013. Gosh, it was a while ago.
Yeah, I got my PhD in 2013. And I love that you set a boundary for yourself, because I feel like, I know this isn't just me, but it's definitely my story was the opposite, where I went on the market, but I applied to jobs that were probably not super competitive. Part of the reason was I wanted to stay in Florida because my then boyfriend, now husband, was there, and it would be hard for him to uproot his career in life. And I grew up in Florida and enjoyed it for a little while. I'm definitely glad I moved now. And so like I took jobs that weren't super great jobs, but they allowed me to stay somewhere I wanted to be. And I felt like I sacrificed a lot, though. Like the departments weren't great. The city wasn't a place I wanted to be. But I feel like I continued to like suppress my own desires, because for the sake of the career, right? Like you have to do this. This is the way academia is. And I think so many people, just from, I'm sure you have these conversations too with them, they do the exact same thing. They try to squish themselves down into that box because it's what we're quote unquote supposed to do. And it just ends up in misery. So I love that you set that boundary for yourself and said, I tried, it didn't work out, I'm going to go do something else.
Yeah, well, it was about saying like, this is not good enough. Like me waiting around for a third season to maybe move somewhere where I don't really want to live. Like, no, not good enough, and drawing that boundary. And it's funny, I was remembering a PhD who I connected with once who was, near tears because people had shamed her for not taking a job in Perth, Australia. Look, if you're from the US, Perth, Australia is around the world. Maybe you have family and friends that you want to be close to and not, a 24-hour, 48-hour journey away from, right, in total. And that few folks were shaming her of like, oh, well, you're not really committed if you're not willing to take that job on the other side of the planet. No, that's just asking too much. And I think nonprofits on the whole and universities have a really like uniform culture of this. So just asking more than is really reasonable. And yes, folks are doing important work and they are willing to make some sacrifices for that work. But like, how much? How much are you willing to sacrifice? Willing to sacrifice your community, your friends, the way of life that you want? Sometimes the ask is just too big. And so for me, the ask wasn't crazy, right? It was just stay on the market and sort of go get a job in a location that you don't know yet. But at least for me, that was too far. And for many folks, the sort of bridge too far is really pretty unreasonable. And so first and foremost, it's okay for folks to say, this is what I want to live. This is where I want to live. This is the type of life I want to have. And if academia can't meet me there, I need to find something else.
Yeah, and it's okay to have desires or to want to be happy in areas of your life aside from your job, that the job isn't just the only thing that matters.
Academia is funny about that too, because it really, and we've talked about this in other conversations, like it really infuses into your identity. And so this like notion that you might do something for other parts of your identity that are not just succeeding in this academic world. Again, I know for anyone who's listening to it, who's in that world, it feels like you might be the only one. It feels like you might be really an outsider if you're considering, what if there are things that are important to me other than this academic identity? But at least for me, the sad narrowness of putting that much of your identity, it's almost as though you were investing stocks in a portfolio and you had 90% of your money in one stock. It's just a very risky strategy. And I think for identities as well, it's almost healthier if we have multiple selves we are part of, because then we don't put so many expectations and demands on one thing. And I think academia just has this culturally norm of like, this needs to be really important to you. It needs to be your one thing. You need to be willing to give up everything for it, or else you're a failed academic. Like, how silly is that? That's ridiculous. I'm glad we can see it now on the other side, but I remember how strange that thinking was when I first started hearing it, right?
Yeah, it's hard to see it when you're still in there. So what was it like to go to Facebook?
Yeah, well, I was happy to be back in California. And oh gosh, it was a huge amount of learning. I remember in my first few weeks there, I went and found a photo of me with a chimp, and I put it in my notebook on my desk and wrote, "I know things, just not these things." Right? Almost to remind myself that like I wasn't a total doofus. It's just like I knew stuff that was, because I was just so consistently out of my depth. And again, I had sort of shown in the interviews that I could like make it work, but I was very much a newbie in a number of areas. And so definitely there was a lot to learn in terms of just how work got done, how to do effective data science work, even just how an organization worked. I remember one of the best things I did was there was an admin assistant for my team who basically sat there and whiteboarded like who all the people were and what they did and how they related to each other. And I just felt too dumb to ask that of my formal manager. But her willingness to just sit down, and she like wrote it on a whiteboard and then she erased it because she's like, this is the inside baseball view, right? But just questions like that, like I have a manager, but I have a product manager, like who's my manager, right? And so I do think the extent to which I had a ton to learn, I couldn't really have anticipated, but it honestly was, probably 6 months until I just felt like I was sort of treading water. And then honestly, probably a couple years till I really got the hang of how working in corporate, like really felt like I was surfing on the right wave as opposed to, just barely hanging on to a life preserver. And so it was definitely a big learning curve, but there were aspects that were so wonderful too. I remember there was one article that I read at some point in academia that said, every academic needs a wife, right? And it was this like, how hard it was to be an academic if you didn't have someone staying at home taking care of all this other stuff. And what was really cool is that I realized in some sense, Facebook was being my wife in the sense that it was taking care of laundry. It was taking care of meals. It would take care of transport. They had an on-site gym. They had an on-site dentist. They had an on-site doctor. And so a lot of this stuff that sort of was the logistics of life, that if you were a solo academic, you had to just manage yourself. Facebook was taken care of. Now, granted, it's because they wanted you to spend more time working, but just that notion that an employer would say, hey, this is part of your life and we're going to take care of it for you. They got even more generous over the years. They started doing like IVF benefits and all these things, egg freezing. That was just like really like, we want to make sure you're taken care of as a human so that you can work. But I think nonprofits are sort of like, you should thank us for the fact that we've given you a desk and that's it. And so this notion that like an employer could really take care of their employees full stop was a really nice change. And so even though there was all that difficulty in learning about the job, the sense of like, hey, this employer actually is trying to really do me right in terms of salary and benefits instead of shortchange me at every corner. That was a really nice and really immediate change you could experience just from day one of working at a perk-heavy company like that.
So did you feel like so going back to that quote, the I know things, just not these things, did you feel like your academic training and experience equipped you to be better at learning what you had to learn in those first 6 months to a couple of years? Or how did...
Maybe. I think one thing I struggled with, and I've seen folks struggle with this even more if they leave at the faculty level, is that I hadn't been a newbie in a long time. Like when you're a PhD, you're an expert in something. And so you're learning things about it, but you're drawing on this long depth of years of research. And so there's rarely something that's like totally new or totally surprising. And I just at that time wasn't doing a lot of hobbies or other things where I was like a total beginner. And so to go to some things where I was a total beginner, right? Like SQL. I taught myself SQL for the job interview, but when I got into the job, we were using this version of SQL that's called Hive, and it was actually quite complex to get right, like actually just hard, right? And so this sense of like having to do it and fail and do it and fail and having people be like, oh my God, that's terrible. I just wasn't used to being bad at stuff, both because I was never bad at my academic career. And it had just been a long time since like even the first paper you publish is like a little bit difficult. But then it was like a lot of the things I was doing were routinized. I was pro at them. And so just that feeling of being new, I would actually say was harder because as an academic, I hadn't been new at something in a long time. And I do think it actually took me a long time to be able to leverage the skills that they had hired me for, right? This sort of quantitative thinking, A/B testing, understanding good data, just because it took me so long to get the sort of context of like, how does work get done? Who do we do it with? What are the tools? Really, it took me about 6 months to get those set up so that I could actually start, like probably at Facebook about 6 months in is when I started actually helping the team do stuff. But really, bro, my first 6 months, I was just like, oh, what's going on? And so, but by 6 months, it was actually like, okay, let me help this PM ask the right questions of their data and run an effective A/B test and make an effective choice from the data they're seeing. And so I'm starting to do better work from that point onwards. But yeah, maybe I'm misremembering the dates, but it feels like it was probably 6 months until I was able to actually use the skills that I'd been hired for because I had finally figured out the sort of pieces where I could apply them.
Yeah. Probably very uncomfortable to feel like you're treading water in that way. But something I would want to just highlight for folks is that it took you 6 months to feel like you were contributing, but they didn't fire you right away. Like I think a lot of people have this fear that they're going to the imposter syndrome, right? They're going to get hired by Facebook or whoever. And 3 days later, the people are going to suddenly realize, oh, you really don't know anything. We're going to fire you. And so it sounds like they were also investing you by giving you time, investing in you by giving you time to learn the ropes.
Sort of. I would say more so at Google than Facebook. For example, when I started in my new role at Google, my manager really said, like, look, it'll probably take up to six to 12 months for you to really hit the ground running. And that's like an expectation and I'll set it. Facebook is giving you that time, but that's probably just because it's performance managed practices. They happen on a 6-month cadence. And so it's sort of like, if you really sucked and you weren't doing something like illegal or problematic, you just had low performance, they would manage you out at Facebook, but it would take 6 to 12 months because they need to create a paper trail and all those things. If you do something illegal, it's slow. Like really like problematic, they will terminate you much quicker. But just for poor performance, like, yeah, you can actually poor perform for a year and they'll have a hard time getting you out without creating enough paper trail that they won't get sued, right? So they're just a little more formal as an employment place. And so because the mechanisms to weed out poor performance are slower, but yeah, even in that 6 months where I was really struggling, I managed to get to like average performance rating, which kept me away from the you're going to get fired track. And so even though I felt like I was in over my head, like by really working hard, I was able to get average. And that was a huge win for me. But it is sort of, I do think at Google, there was much more like, we know this place is difficult, where Facebook, and I think it still has this culture, is like, we don't have time to absorb folks learning and growing. So like get with it, or, we will find other paths for you. And I managed to get with it. And yes, I had months. I didn't have weeks or days. So yes, for anyone who's like in week 2 and is like, I haven't mastered it yet, it's like, it's okay. Like really your first 90 days are where you're setting the tone. And if you're like me and you onboard slowly in 6 months, you may be sort of able to hang on by your fingernails, but it's not something where you have to onboard within a week. That's just not realistic with this amount of new stuff to pick up.
Yeah. So did you have a similar role when you moved to Google and how was, no?
Not really, no. So I basically, at Facebook, I did a data science role. And at Google, I moved into a team called People Analytics. So it had a similar idea of using quantitative inputs to make decisions. But there were 2 key differences. One, it was inside the HR department as opposed to working with product teams like I had at Facebook. It also had a lot more PhDs in the group, so that was a just different profile. The second was that it was an analyst role as opposed to a data scientist role. And so the technical bar was different, where data science was really trying to keep its technical prowess to stay adjacent to the engineering orgs. And you had to be doing stuff like writing Python pipelines and just doing a lot of technical complexity. An analyst role was more, if you think about working with employee data as opposed to Facebook user data, Google has, I think nowadays, something like 100,000 employees, where Facebook has, trillions of lines of data feed. And so just the data set that you're working with as an analyst is usually a little less complex than one with data science in the title. And that was honestly a better fit for me. It allowed me to not have to spend as much of my time on the technical stuff and really say, I want to spend my time on the insights, not on data wrangling. And so it was sort of a step towards a less technically complex, more people-facing role that I moved towards. Personally, the reason I moved was that was just, HR is the area that hasn't been moneyballed. That was the idea in my mind, was like, look, what if we could use quantitative methods to understand who we're hiring and how to retain them? And it was this big vision of like what HR could be with quantitative methods. I thought if anyone was doing it, it was this Google group because they were at sort of the vanguard. I then got into HR and realized it was nothing like that. And so that dream was not at all a reality. But I had the dream of what numbers could do for HR. The dream still exists. I don't think it's going to happen in the short run, but it was me sort of saying, okay, I want to take a gamble on a different like conception of a role, a different like raison d'etre of a role, and see if I can make something happen for a company as a result.
Yeah, it sounds like you wanted more human connection, or at least to think when you're analyzing the numbers, make it less about the numbers and more about the understanding of human behavior.
Yes, and the other thing that really differs between working in a technical group and an HR group, among many, is just the gender balance. And it was really hard being in a male-skewed group, just constantly being one of one or two women in the room. I had worked with some awesome women at Facebook, and so I had some connection, but it was just this sort of like, I'm tired of, some of that technical stuff. There was this practice I like to call technical dick measuring. And I was like, I'm tired of technical dick measuring. Like, I don't want to do. So I had a belief that, okay, if I go to a group that has more women in it, it will feel different. And it did, but it turned out what I learned after working in a technical group, working in HR, and then finally landing in marketing. In my opinion, either too many men or too many women is a problem. So marketing ended up being 50-50 and ended up being the type of org I worked the best in, just because some of the norms that came when you had a group that had more women also didn't work for me. And so I ended up, through jumping around, really finally landing on a group where it felt like both of those sort of habits that you get from male and female stereotypes, right? But both of those sort of practices got averaged out in the marketing group. But at least at that point, I was like, what would it look like to work in a group that wasn't so heavily male? And the answer was different, but not necessarily a fit for me. So
that's interesting. I think you're touching on a lot of stuff that people wouldn't think about, and it seems obvious when you say it, but we just don't even know what to think about as we're considering which job is right for us.
Well, and it's one of the reasons I think I work with folks in their first move out of academia, and then sometimes again 2 years later. Because when you're first doing this search, all you're looking for, honestly, people say to me, they're like, I want to pay, I want it to pay, I want to do interesting things with smart people, right? It's like way too vague. And so they like go out and they find that, but then it's like, oh shoot, there's all these other parameters I didn't consider. Will I work well with my supervisor? Do I like the reason that this function exists and what this company is doing? Do I like the way these teams interact? You would just never know to ask about them, nor would I say an academic should almost have a lone scorecard like that, just because they won't really know how they themselves will match up. And so really on your first sort of swing, you do just have to say, here are the parameters I know, where can I find a connect? But yeah, there are actually a lot more parameters that you won't know until you're in a place that doesn't fit for them. And so the good news is once you have the tools for sort of fit finding, you can then adjust and craft things to what you're discovering about yourself, what you're discovering about these environments. But I would never recommend that someone go out and do the sort of comprehensive research or assessment up front just because they don't know enough about themselves yet.
So how did you get into coaching?
So that was a different set of parameters. And again, it really was getting to know myself even deeper. I was at Google for 4 years. And there was a point where I was reflecting on what work I enjoyed most at Google. And the thing that came to mind were these PhD conversations I was doing, which weren't even my Google work. But I every now and then would just get a referral from someone who said, hey, you want to leave academia? Tori left academia, talk to her. And so these are like Friday conversations that I just connect with folks. And I realized I loved that feeling of opportunity that I could create for folks, of hope, of potential, through just chatting with them and saying what was possible. I also at that time was a people manager and really loved growing and developing my team. But unfortunately, as a people manager, as a big company, I really couldn't spend more than 10-15% of my budget developing my team. And so it was sort of this, what if I could do that all the time? What if I could have those conversations that open up possibility for folks and develop them, but have that be my 80% instead of my 10%? And so I connected with someone who I had known from my time in HR who recommended I do some coaching training to see if I liked it. I went and did a first coaching training at the CTI, the Coactive Training Institute, loved it, went through their whole program. But I think it was sort of recognizing where I was lighting up most in my work, and it wasn't necessarily the core responsibility of my job. Then sort of gradually exploring it through coursework, through coaching individuals, before choosing to leave Google and start my own business with a coaching practice.
So when you were starting the coaching training, did you think this could potentially turn into a successful business and I could leave my career here? Or was it just about trying new things? And
I think with my very first course, it was just, I think I like this, but I don't even really know what this is. So like, let me see if the thing I like is actually coaching, and like get a sense from these people who say they train coaches of what coaching is. And the great news was that their first program had a money back guarantee. So I was like, great, if I hate it, like I can get my money back. But just as like a personal growth exercise, and I actually budgeted as professional development as a manager. So I got Google to pay for part of the training. But it was basically like, look, this is going to be useful soft skills training no matter what. I think I only started to get a sense for the viability of doing it as a business as I went through more courses, because the people who were leading them and assisting them were people who were doing this. And we would have Q&As during the programs. It was like, wow, they're actually running businesses doing this. So I think the very first thing was just like, is this thing that I like actually coaching? And as I spend more time in coaching, do I still like it? It was sort of an enjoyment check. And then later became like a viability check of like, could I actually build a business around this?
That's interesting. So when you did take the leap, tell us about that. Where did you start with your business and how did you grow it?
Yeah. So I left Google when I had 2 clients, which was actually very bold. Like that was not at all my run rate. But basically what I did is I gave myself almost like what did I give myself? 6 or 12 months, like a 6 to 12 month venture capital funding, where it was basically like, you have this funding to go try to make this work. We're going to check in at the end of the year and see how it's going. And so I made some like financials and some sort of like, here's where I need to be in order to consider another year of investment. But fortunately, because I had worked at these places, I could basically give myself a year to make no money. And I basically made the forecast that like I would be in the red the whole year. It turned out to be far more pessimistic than was the reality, but it was almost like, I'm going to give you a year to go figure this out. I also moved to Mexico because that gave me a year. It actually gave me multiple years, where if I had been in San Francisco, paying San Francisco rent and groceries, would have been more like 6 months. And from the folks who I'd talked to who had built coaching practices, therapist practices, they actually said it's probably going to take 2 to 4 years to get up and running. And so this notion of trying to force myself to do that in SF just wouldn't have been real. And so the nice thing was going to Mexico, I could say, look, I could have honestly 18 months, 2 years of making no money and still be fine. And so it was an investment in myself and sort of okay, we're going to check in on this. Now, I did give notice in February 2020, which was a really weird time to give notice. And so I remember I gave my notice, and then like the week after I was like, is this stupid? Like they just said the border closed, like we're in lockdown, what happens? And so it was a really scary time to leave something stable because the whole world was in a state of ambiguity. I'm actually now really grateful because I think COVID was actually a great time for coaching. A lot of people were sort of had time to kill and so decided to grow personally. So it turned out to be a great time to start the business. But just in terms of the logistics of moving and the fear of like not having health insurance at a time when COVID was, still early, was very scary. But yeah, I had sort of made the decision to leave by the beginning of 2020, had enough viability and enough runway so that if it failed, I would still be okay. I also kept connections with one manager who I was like, I'll bet he'll hire me back if I really screw up. And so for the first few years, sort of kept in contact with him. But yeah, then I didn't screw up as much as I anticipated. And so it was viable to continue. I passed my venture capital funding test. I mean, realistically, I wouldn't. Like if I were a VC, I would be looking for this to be way bigger. But the Tory venture capital, which is just make this a profitable business. Yeah, I met that assessment.
So and I want to get into what you do now as a coach, but having this, perspective, this being able to look at all of this in hindsight, for people who are in academia thinking about possibly leaving, what would you say to them if they think, well, I could either do industry or I could do nonprofit or I could start a business, right, with an academic business or something? How should somebody go about making that decision? And what do you think are the pros and cons of each?
Yeah. Well, and I think for each person, it really depends, like, what's important to you and almost what's the problem you're looking to fix, right? What's not working for you about where you are? Because each of these things sort of, you can pull various levers to fix your problem. And so the better you can know, like, what's not working for me, the better you can see one of these choices as a solution that actually will effectively close the gap. One of the main reasons I still feel really good about sending folks from academia to industry, even though I don't work in a corporate job anymore, is because just that pure financial taken care of factor. A lot of folks in academia are in financial stress and almost don't even acknowledge it. Academics has, it has stability of the job. It has usually pretty good health insurance per the pay grade. But a lot of that stuff, like a 401k or a performance bonus, just remains completely off the table. And so one of the things I love there is just, almost independent of where you end up going with your career. If you can go there with a stronger backing, right, with a bit of W-2 pay, with a bit of 401k matching, it just opens a lot of doors that I'm very grateful for. And so I do think, if you are really just like, I'm in a lot of financial insecurity and or I want to live in a major geographic area that has a lot of jobs, corporate jobs just take care of their people decently well. And so it's a nice thing to experience an employer who actually is nice to you as opposed to a university employer. The funny thing about running your own business is you are your employer. And so I think for folks, one of the things I loved about academia was actually the freedom it granted me to just go and research a topic. And that was a freedom that you sort of have in corporate, but you sort of don't. It's sort of like, here's what the company is doing. Here's what the team is doing. Here's what we need you to do. Figure out how to do it and how to do it well. But like, you don't get as much decision-making authority. And so I think I chafed at that for many years and sort of wanted to be in the decision-making seat, wanted to be the ideator and the hypothesis generator as opposed to just the implementer. And so for me, at least, saying, okay, now I've got enough financial resources to not be in financial stress to go try this out. I think being in your own company, you have all the decision-making authority. And so I do think for each person sort of looking at this, it's like, look, how is my financial situation? How important is me to change that? If it's really important to actually alleviate financial stress, staying in a nonprofit or starting your own business are going to be the harder paths. Corporate is sort of the quickest way to close that loop. If it's, I don't have a lot of flexibility, I feel like I'm laden with service responsibilities in this faculty job, and I want the freedom to actually build something that feels like it delivers the kind of value and impact I want in the world, then jumping to your own business actually gives you the most degrees of freedom there. It requires sort of different parameters in terms of finances, in terms of self-management, but there are definitely things where each person should say, like, what's most important to me for this next chapter in my career? And the thing is that even if you go start a business and it totally fails, that chapter of freedom, of learning, of discovery will still pay dividends for whatever direction you go. Same way that going and working in corporate, even if it's a long-term fit, the amount that you have in your bank account will give you much more flexibility for what you need to do in the future. And so I think getting really honest as best we can of like, yes, there are 12 things I want from a new job. Which one do I really want to make sure I optimize for in this next choice? I do think there's a big difference there in financial flexibility. There's a big difference in like project flexibility and decision-making flexibility. And so the more we can get to know ourselves and get to know what's important for us and what we're willing to compromise versus not, the better we can choose the employment model that fits what we want to move towards.
I love that answer because, what I didn't hear you say is, think about the topics that you want to be working on or the job title that you want to have or anything like that. What I heard you say is think about what you feel like is missing from your life right now in your academic job. What are you craving? What are you missing? What do you feel like you don't have enough of that you want more of? And then go after that. And so to me, the answer you gave sounds a lot more about the life that we want to have, and understood holistically. To go back to the earlier point that your life is not just your job, it is all these different things together. So I think that's really helpful.
There's also a weird thing that comes to mind that when you say that, I think of, and I think maybe I was in this at this point, but I'm so distant from this mindset. I do observe other folks in it though. And it's almost like charting your job path based on the story it shows to other people. And I think for some of us in academia, it's almost like we're doing it for the imaginary tenure committee, right? And it's sort of like, I want to make sure I make the right moves so that then when I'm presenting my portfolio, you will like it. But I've seen folks do this in corporate too, where it's almost like, I want to rack up the job titles so that my resume looks pretty to someone else. Almost like we're telling a story to someone else. And look, whenever we move jobs, we do have to have a narrative, right? But honestly, now I've made so many moves, like you can make that narrative up for a lot of stuff. Take that from the woman who worked with chimpanzees and went to go be a data scientist at Facebook. Like you can make a lot of gaps closable. But like if that's your primary motivator of like, I'm going to go put myself in something 40 plus hours a week just because I think it makes a nice story for someone else to see the achievements I'm stacking up. That one, folks come to me and then say like, why isn't that making me happy? And it's because you're optimizing for optics instead of for fulfillment. And at least for me, that the longer I've been in this business, the more it's like, how do I keep an eye towards my fulfillment and try to keep my work close to that so that I can hold space for others to do that too? And we can have fulfilling work that then meets a lot of other success criteria. But sometimes if we chase success or prestige first and foremost, fulfillment isn't going to come along for the ride. So we can find success via fulfillment, but we won't automatically find fulfillment via success. So it's important to keep that, like what makes me happy? What do I actually enjoy? What do I want more or less of? It's important to keep that first and foremost and less the like, but how is this going to look, right? I do think that sort of idea of how other people are going to view us makes a lot of folks make choices based on funny parameters that don't end up working out as well as they might hope.
Yeah, I definitely felt that pressure to please other people. Like you said, you plan out your career, or you think you're planning out your career based on the research you enjoy doing, but then you realize once you're in the tenure track role in particular, you're doing it for the committee. You teach the classes that your department wants you to teach. You advise the the number of students or the clubs or whatever that they need you to do because you're part of this family and the university and we all take care of each other. And then you don't get a raise for 5 years. But anyway, yeah, I think and something I say a lot in my program or when I'm talking to people about this, as morbid as it sounds, when you're laying on your deathbed, when you're hopefully at the end, you're 95 years old, you've had this very long life. Are you going to be wondering if your former department chair is pleased with you? Or are you going to be thinking about your children who are gathered around you, or your partner, or your loved ones, or your pets, or whatever, that are surrounding you, and grateful that you were with them and that you devoted time to the things you cared about? Or, are you glad that you pursued your art hobby or your dancing or your whatever brings you joy? I don't think people think about that enough.
But it's funny that, as you're talking about it, I don't think it's crazy that we approach things this way, because at least for me in school, it's about the exam. So it's like you study for the exam and you perform on the exam, and that's how you know if you did well. And so I do think there's a tendency to sort of take that in the jobs too. And it's almost like imagining that there will be someone who comes and grades you on your career accomplishments and that you're trying to really make sure you've done what you need to have a really good end output for that review. But it's funny, like, and so school trains us for that sort of thing, that sort of mindset of like, I got to perform well on the final exam. I got to get the pieces together, do the studying so that someone else will say I'm okay. But unfortunately, in your job, like you are the prover, you are the decision maker, you are the doer. Maybe you have some internal voice that's sort of doing that scorecard of you, but it's ultimately just you. And so you really having a conversation with you and saying like, even if we're going to create a scorecard, like what's on that scorecard? Is it the things that like I think it should be? Like, are these actually the boxes that matter to me? Or do they just feel like the ones everyone's using? And so they're sort of on my scorecard. And so the funny thing there is there's no longer this sort of structured exam teacher approval that I think we all get conditioning in from school. It's more this choose your own adventure. And like you get to define what good looks like. And if you're not doing that, you're using someone else's proxy, or you're just sort of going with the flow of what other people say is important. And so if you haven't taken the time to actually say, here's what's important to me, here's what I want, and here's how I get there, someone else's goals are probably what you'll be working towards, whether explicitly or implicitly. And so it's important to try to set your own goals, because otherwise people will happily exploit your time for theirs.
So let's say that somebody decides they want to go into industry or corporate or, some kind of job like that. You and I have talked a lot about how, because I did this a lot. And, I think like, man, if I had worked with Tori when I was on the non-academic job market, I would have probably actually landed a job that I liked, and then I would have never started my business. So there's like pros and cons there. But I fell into this trap. I knew I couldn't stay in academia. I quit my job. We moved to Maine. My husband had a job waiting for him here. So I had a little bit of that financial cushion where it wasn't like a rush to, didn't have to get a job the next day. And so I was applying to data science jobs, to UX research was big. This was like late 2019, early 2020. And it was very much this blind search, like the spray and pray approach, where like, I'm just going to make my CV into a one-page resume and send it to as many people as I possibly can. And A, that's exhausting. And B, it doesn't work. So I'm curious how in your program, if you have somebody who comes to you who says, okay, this is what I want for my life. I want this financial security. I want this structure. I want the benefits. What do you tell them? How do you work with people in your program to help them avoid the spray and pray and this constant discouragement?
Well, and it's funny because you're stepping through some of the things I do in my program. That first step I call internal exploration, which is like get to know yourself, get to know what matters to you, what's important to you as best as you're able to articulate it. And what I say then is then you have to complement it with some market exploration. So you actually go out and you say, what's out there? What's growing? What are the possibilities? And it could be working for a given role family or a given industry or working for yourself. But you almost do a survey of what's out there. And then you start keeping some doors open, but closing others based on two parameters, enjoyment and viability. Do I think I would enjoy this? Do I think it would fit what actually I've said is important? And then how viable is it to make this leap? And actually, AI now gives some pretty good answers on the viability piece, where you say, I have a PhD in biology and I want to be a COO at a Fortune 500 company. How possible is that? And it's like, well, right? Or if you say like, I want to go be a data scientist at this type of company, where it's like, you can make that work. Here's how, right? And so checking viability. And again, anything is viable. Like you could make that big leap viable. It's just going to take more time, more willingness to be told no a lot, more finesse. And so often I recommend that folks look for stuff where it's like, okay, there's a couple of hoops for you to jump to, but you've basically explored the market, reviewed a couple of options and said, this one feels like it's the closest fit, both for what I'll enjoy and say is important and for viability. And so I do think folks don't make those decisions. They don't do that survey. And so they just sort of fire things off based on reading a job description and thinking it looks interesting. And unfortunately, the problem with that is you haven't done your homework. The same way that if we're running a business, we need to get to know our customer and get to know what they want and what they care about and how to speak to them. It's the same process in applying for a job, right? Who's your customer? Who's your reader? Okay, it's a recruiter or a hiring manager. What do they care about? What are they thinking about? What are they looking for? And how do you make it as quickly apparent to them as possible? And I think actually in academics, we've done this in teaching. In teaching, we say, we got this thing. How do I get it to the students in the most digestible way possible? So we've taken a sort of, customer of our materials and we've refined stuff for them. We just don't take those same skills and apply them to applying for jobs. And then we know about research. We know how to go out and make sense of disparate inputs. But it's like when folks are job seeking, they just completely forget their research and their curiosity, sometimes because it becomes validation seeking of I need someone to tell me I'm okay. I need someone to tell me I'm good enough. I won't feel I'm good enough until I get an interview. And unfortunately, when we job search that way, we shut down those more effective capacities we have of curiosity and research, of narrative building. Those go out the window if all we're looking to do is just get a quick hit that someone likes us. And so to the extent that we say, like, look, I have a lot I bring to the table. I'm looking for a place where that fits. Let me explore and then figure out how to convey that fit. I do think that's one of the things folks struggle with. And it's either because they don't know it's a thing and they never do it, or they don't do it well, right? They haven't actually picked something that fits or picked a good story to illustrate that fit.
Yeah, I think you're demonstrating what I find to be so valuable about all kinds of coaching, but particularly in the career coaching space. And that's like I'm assuming when somebody comes to you to get help landing a job, you're not just teaching them, here's how you write your resume, here's how you write a cover letter, right? It's not just the tools. I'm sure you do give all those tools, but you're also leading them through a journey of personal exploration, of empowering themselves to think like, okay, I have an opportunity here to change my life for the better. What's the most effective and efficient way that I can do that? How am I most likely to land in a position that I'm going to enjoy? Even if I'm not there forever, maybe I'll enjoy it for a couple of years and change my mind. Fine, no problem. That is perfectly acceptable. But at least I am going to get something out of it intellectually, emotionally, right? Getting something out of this next step and be able to accomplish whatever my goals are without that feeling of being completely and utterly lost. So I love how you're just so great at making people feel good. I always feel good after I talk to you.
I'm glad to hear it. And so interesting, as you were talking, I was like, yeah, that is sort of what I do, but I could never put it in that language because folks wouldn't relate to it. But it's interesting. The other thing I will say is like that opportunity to make your life better is correlated with, but not entirely overlapping with feeling better. And so if folks are coming to a job search or coming to a coach just to feel better, that's a different problem, right? That's a different problem. Like that's something that's going on emotionally, right? That's something that is maybe better addressed in therapy of like, I just don't feel good day to day, right? A job search is actually a really bad tool for that because it's going to make you feel bad a lot. And so sort of looking to either a coach or a job search to sort of say like, I feel bad, I want to feel better. It's not necessarily going to work as you would hope. But saying, I'm recognizing this doesn't meet my needs. And so for the long term, I want something that's going to be a better fit. And I'm willing to tolerate some short-term work and discomfort. Because honestly, even though I make the job search easier for folks, it is still an effort. It is still time invested. It's still things that aren't going to click. And so really saying to yourself, like, what am I looking for from this exercise? And am I willing to take the sort of discomfort and ambiguity to get to the other side? What makes it worth it for me? And what would make it worth it putting in all that effort, right? What's going to be better enough that it's worth that effort? But not sort of looking to it as an exercise just to feel better. Because unfortunately, when you are job searching effectively, you will start to feel good about it, but it'll get you from neutral to good. It won't necessarily get you from bad to neutral. And so if you're
Yeah.
feeling bad, if you're feeling desperate, it's a really tough place to job search from. And I would say the first fix is actually like, how do I get back to a neutral headspace? Just because that can be it can be a really ugly loop that folks get into for a job search of just feeling worse and worse and worse about themselves. So if anyone's feeling that, it's okay to feel that way, and go out and look for tools that are going to help you get support, because things like Recovering Academics, right? Those groups will help you see that you're not alone in those feelings, but those are just not feelings that are going to guide you in the right places in your job search.
Yeah, that's a great. And I've definitely had a lot of people say they enrolled in my program after they've been through quite a lot of therapy around like leaving academia and the damage it's done. So you are absolutely not alone out there if you even if it feels like it. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. And tell us, if people want to work with you, how can they get in touch? Tell us about your program and anything else you want to add before we sign off.
Yeah, honestly, the best way for folks to stay connected with me and find ways to work with me is through LinkedIn right now. To actually, and hopefully we can put this in the show notes or whatever, but come follow me on LinkedIn. And that's where I'll have invitations to group programs, workshops, one-on-one coaching, various ways you can connect with me. I may be iterating a little bit in terms of how I work with folks. And so just in general, LinkedIn. You can also check out my website, victoriawobber.com, or if you're trying to leave academia, my website, academicexit.com. That's really a toolkit for PhDs looking to leave. If you're hearing this and you're more thinking of those bigger picture coaching topics that we've talked about today, right? Like, what do I want for my life? How do I make work better serve me? That's the sort of stuff where I often work with folks one-on-one to go deeper there. And so folks can follow me on LinkedIn as well to figure out how to work with me in one of those various ways.
Great. Thanks so much, Tori.
Yeah, wonderful chatting with you as always, Paulina.
If you're unhappy in academia and you think you might be a good editor or writing coach, check out my course, Becoming an Academic Editor. This digital course is paired with a 12-week group coaching program to support you through your decision to leave academia or not, and to start building a profitable and rewarding academic editing business. Learn more by going to acadiaediting.com/become an editor. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time.